Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Monique Monjon, Project Manager at BookNet Canada. Welcome to the year of testing dangerously, the EPUB 3.3 story. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today, an acknowledgement that is deeply personal due to this virtual platform and the wide range of locations people are joining from today. Today, I am broadcasting from the traditional territories of the original nations of this land, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat Indigenous peoples. I encourage you to visit the nativeland.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose land you are joining from today. BookNet Canada endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. In spirit of that acknowledgement, I confirm our responsibility in mending the sacred hoop with Canada's Indigenous peoples, to be an ally to all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to unite and work alongside one another. Now, let me introduce our speakers. Wendy Reid is the Accessibility and Publishing Standards Lead at Rakuten Kobo, a retailer, publisher, and reading system developer for ebooks and audiobooks. She is responsible for Kobo's accessibility and standards work, where she mainly focuses on digital accessibility and standards for ebooks and audiobooks. She is one of the co-chairs of the EPUB 3 Working Group and Audiobooks Working Group, as well as the editor of the audiobooks W3C Recommendation. She has been a speaker at eBook Craft and Tech Forum, Audio Live, London Book Fair, Frankfurt Book Fair, and Ally Camp TO. And joining Wendy is Dave Cramer, a senior digital publishing technology specialist at Hachette Book Group, one of the big 5 trade publishers in the US. He develops standards, workflows, and tools for both print and ebook production using web technologies. He first started working with ebooks in 2001 and created the first commercial EPUB files for Hachette in 2007. He was the co-editor of the IDPF fixed layout specification and wrote BISG's Field Guide to Fixed Layout. He's a former member of the W3C CSS Working Group and helped edit specs on Paged Media. Dave is now the co-chair of W3C's EPUB 3 Working Group, working on the forthcoming EPUB 3.3. He's been a speaker at BEA, Digital Book World, Tools of Change, eBook Craft, and Books and Browsers. So, without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Dave and Wendy.
Thank you, Mo.
Thank you, Mo.
All right. Let's get this up on screen. All right, so welcome to the year of testing dangerously, the EPUB 3.3 story. Mo's already introduced us, so I think we can skip right over this part. Quick glossary of acronyms. We tried to point out anything that we use in the presentation, so we will be referring to the W3C several times, the World Wide Web Consortium. For those who don't know them, they are a standards body that focuses on producing specifications for web technology, including things like HTML and CSS and EPUB. And we'll also make reference to PWAs, or progressive web apps. But we're going to tell you a story today, and it all begins with a dramatic test result. I'll hand it over to Dave.
I'm going to share my screen here in just a moment. So this is Thorium, the open source EPUB reading system developed by EDR Lab in Europe. What I have loaded here is 128 EPUB test files, which are designed to test every statement in the EPUB spec. We'll go into this a little more in more detail later, but I just want to give you a quick illustration of what the reason we do tests. This is a test of a really simple thing. The spec says that EPUB reading systems must support SVG, scalable vector graphics. And so I open up the test and I see a little statement, test passes, if you can see an image below, and I see, an outline of a red heart with the letters CC in it, which I believe is the Creative Commons license. And so far, this is all normal enough. And so we wrote a bunch of tests. Some of them are kind of fun. If you're a very old web developer, you might remember the acid test, which was a way to test to make sure browsers support like all sorts of HTML and CSS. In this case, this is sort of a complicated pixelated smiley face, but it's a little bit broken because this reading system doesn't support every bit of CSS and HTML that it should. This actually should.
Dave, the file hasn't opened.
It hasn't opened.
Yeah.
Your screen sharing is paused, it's saying. I'm going to stop sharing and start over.
Maybe share the whole screen.
I can try that.
I see it now.
Okay, we'll start over here. Sorry about that. So again, this is the mostly okay, but somewhat distorted, pixelated smiley face. You can see there's like a little red bar at the bottom because something should have been positioned differently or layered in the back of this rather than the front. And the eyes are a little strange. Down at the bottom, that's what it should look like, the just yellow and black pixelated smiley face with somewhat strange green eyes. That test was mostly for fun and to show that, these reading systems really have to support a lot of CSS to work. But what really surprised us was when we started looking at manifest fallbacks. It's probably not something that most people use when they make EPUBs, but it's sort of foundational to the concept of EPUB, that you can put sort of any file type in an EPUB as long as there's a fallback to something that it's supposed to support. We mostly know this because, a spine document must be HTML or SVG. You're not allowed to use raw images in the spine for various reasons, but you could do that if you had a fallback to an HTML document. And so I started making some tests of the fallback mechanism, and really strange things started to happen. You see here that I just got a download dialog from my EPUB for a DMG file. This is not what should have happened. If the reading system didn't support this file type, it should have shown an HTML document that I told it to look at. We see this as kind of just a little scary because it might be a security risk. We looked at that for a bunch of other things. An XML document, and what happened was that rather than showing the backup, it just showed this browser tree view of the XML, which is not particularly useful to anybody. We're just seeing all sorts of problems. So this core feature of EPUB, it turns out that essentially no reading system supports it. And that was a big surprise. I'm going to hand it back to Wendy.
Mm-hmm. So just to backtrack a little bit, why are we doing these tests and why we are actually going through this process is because of the W3C. So we are working our way through what is called the recommendation process, and W3C uses the term recommendation for specifications. And every document that goes through the W3C has to go through the process. There is even a document called the process document. And this defines specific steps for how a document goes from a draft or the idea phase to an official W3C standard. Even though EPUB 3 has been around for years, a long time, it was never a W3C standard. So for this version, we needed to work through the process to make it official. And to give you an idea of what the process is, it's comprised of various steps that a document must go through before it can be published as a recommendation. The first one is the first public working draft. You know, the first version of your document is very easy for EPUB to publish ours. The second is a series of revised working drafts, and you can revise these as many times as you want. The third step is what is known as candidate recommendation. This is where we are, and we'll get a little bit into what that means. The next step after that is proposed recommendation, and it all ends with official full recommendation status. During the process, there's a lot of things that you have to do, especially specifically before you go to candidate recommendation. The idea is that any specification document that a group is publishing should meet a bunch of different criteria. This criteria covers areas like accessibility, technical architecture, internationalization, privacy, and security. And we have had to have checks with various groups in these areas to ensure that our document actually meets those requirements.
Yeah, this is sort of because of, you know, the whole mission of the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium. You know, among their principles is that the web is for everyone. And so by, you know, demanding that web specifications support accessibility, support internationalization, support privacy and security, that's how they ensure that the work we do works for all users. And sort of overlaid over all these processes is the idea of wide review, that we, you know, we're working in public. Anybody can go to our GitHub, anybody can make a comment about an issue. We want as many people as possible to see what we're doing, so that, you know, everybody's needs can be taken into account. And so, you know, we can make something that does work for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And so the candidate recommendation stage, which is where we're at now, is for testing. The idea is that every document that goes through the process has to be proven. You can't just write a spec and publish it and hope for the best. And so every document is tested by user agents. In our specific context, we often refer to them as reading systems. And each user agent is meant to ensure the requirements of the specification are achievable. So all of the statements that we made in the document are provable and implementable, hopefully. Each feature must be verified by at least 2 implementations in order to ensure interoperability. For EPUB, this will be the first time we'll be able to see which reading systems have which features implemented, which is very cool.
Yes, anybody with much experience in EPUB has run into this problem where something works in one place and doesn't work somewhere else. You know, this is at least one way we're trying to be, you know, more public about that, of saying, you know, here's a way to check whether your reading system actually supports the spec as we're writing it.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a little bit about the actual testing and what we are planning to learn from it. And here I couldn't resist a Schitt's Creek GIF. David is saying, this is a teachable moment for all of us, which I think it is. To give you an idea of what a test result actually looks like, we have an example here. We have some results for 3 tests that were performed on 4 different implementations. Apologies for the office dog in the background. And these 3 tests were to cover CSS, MathML, and SVG. And it was tested on an Android progressive web app on an Android platform, a progressive web app on a iOS platform, a web version of this implementation using Chrome, and a web version using Safari. And in this table, we can see that while most of the tests pass, we actually see some platform-specific failures when it comes to MathML in Android and Chrome. In EPUB, interoperability has long been a state we've desired but had no real information on. As Dave kind of alluded to, we have a lot of anecdotes. The book works fine on Apple books, but maybe not on Kobo. And occasionally we've done small tests, but very little published referenceable material. The tests for EPUB will provide some of that information, which we can use to help inform both EPUB, but also future publishing standards. And as we've learned, if you build it, they might not come. Early versions of EPUB 3 were really optimistic, including features that sounded necessary and important to publications, but were not present in reading systems or tools. If we build it, they'll come, was the philosophy. 11 years later, many have been implemented, but some haven't. Testing will allow us to see exactly where things stand so we can build better books and features in the future.
I mean, it's interesting because sometimes, you know, EPUB needed things that weren't fully fleshed out in the web platform at the top. So that's one of the reasons that we invented some of these things that may not have had wide support. You know, when EPUB 3 first came out, we really wanted to have better support for more languages, to support East Asian languages, for example, and CSS wasn't quite there. So we had to invent some of our own prefix CSS properties. So there's a lot of reasons for what they did, but also there was, you know, without this specification process, we could just say, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we had like collections or fancy index features or widgets or something like that. And so we spec'd all these things that sounded like a good idea at the time, but nobody was really interested in implementing them. And so that's, we're trying to do better now.
So let's talk a little bit about EPUB 3.3 and what we hope the impact will be. And here Drew Barrymore is saying, they changed my life. And hopefully we have. The first thing, the most noticeable thing, probably, if you access the new version of the document, is that we have made a fairly big change to how the document is organized. If you looked at version 3.2, which was published a few years ago, you would see that there were 5 different documents: EPUB 3.2, EPUB packages, EPUB content documents, EPUB open container format, and EPUB media overlays. And these were documents that covered specific parts of the spec, but they also covered, you know, both the requirements for a content creator and the requirements for a reading system. In EPUB 3.3, we've taken a different approach where we've actually combined all the documents and separated them now into 2, EPUB 3.3 core and EPUB 3.3 reading systems. And as you can probably guess, reading systems deals with all of the requirements related to the rendering of EPUB documents, and core is all of the content for content creators.
I don't know how many times in my career I've had to open 4 different specs to find the bit of information that I wanted. You know, this was also vastly complicated for our terminology, that, you know, that the packaging was completely separate from the package file, for example, and it's like, you know, and what the heck was the publication spec versus content documents versus all those things. So we're really trying to eliminate as much confusion as possible. You know, a lot of the work we're doing is, you know, trying to clarify things, trying to make things easy to understand, trying to make things easy to find. And for most of those improvements, we have to thank our glorious Canadian editor, Matt Garish, who does all the hard work on this thing.
All hail, Matt. One of the goals, as Dave's kind of alluded to, is to make the EPUB spec more readable. this was really to help with comprehension, readability, really organizing the requirements of the specification to its two components, content and user agent. Core contains all of the requirements for content creators. Reading system covers requirements for user agents, and it's much easier if you're either party to find what you need to find.
Yeah,
Something I did, yeah, oh, go ahead, Dave.
No, just in general, another thing we found is that, there's been so much focus in the specs on how to assemble the EPUB file itself, but the language about how our reading system should interpret that EPUB file was a little behind. And so some of our efforts have been to clarify ambiguities in how reading systems should handle EPUB files, even though they're still left with a ton of latitude about how to present all this information to the user.
Mm-hmm. One of the biggest additions of new content in both specs is new sections on privacy and security. Both documents received a new section that covers both, and the process for creating these actually involved writing a threat model for EPUB. And just to give you an idea, we had to think about what could someone do with an EPUB to potentially harm a user. We looked at areas like scripting, compromised or malicious remote resources, phishing and spoofing. And if you've never heard these terms before, phishing and spoofing refers to either posing as a trusted entity or potentially recreating the page or identity of someone who might be trusted and using that to, steal user information or other things. The collection of user data is considered a threat, as well as user generated content. And there's more in there as well, but both documents really we actually wrote down a series of recommendations, both for content creators and for reading systems, on how to handle these threats or to kind of head them off at the pass. We wanted to be sure that, content creators are very mindful about how they're hosting or providing their resources, how they're, the potential collection of user data and how they should be handling things like that. And most of the time it's just don't. And on the reading system side, it's how to react to scripting, how to handle, something, routing outside of the EPUB, or the case of, if something is trying to detect what the user is doing, what should a reading system do about that? And there's a series of recommendations in the document now to cover both of those cases. And it's a really interesting read for anyone interested in privacy and security.
I think this is another example that shows how valuable this W3C process has been, because we had a bunch of experts in web security come and look at our world from their perspective, which was really interesting. I think many of us have a pretty good sense of how the web works and how people are possibly tracked, and cookies and permissions for certain APIs and all that kind of thing. But they were sort of shocked by how much data collection is done on readers through just reading an everyday ebook through one of the usual apps. They know, I started reading at 9:37 p.m. and read 22 pages until I fell asleep at some time. And, they know which books I finished and which I didn't, and so on and so forth. There's a tremendous amount of data that's being collected about our reading habits. And I'm not sure that people really have a good sense of that, or have a good sense of, what they've agreed to when they start reading an EPUB. So it was interesting for us to see it from their perspective, and for them to see these web technologies used in a really different way than, sort of the server user model from a regular website.
Quick little note about epubcheck is that there will be a new version of epubcheck that will be released with full support for EPUB 3.3. It is currently in beta for anyone who's interested in trying it. It's available at the epubcheck GitHub page.
Yeah, I think this is a lesson we learned the hard way. There was an EPUB 3.1, which was ambitious and tried to fix some of the major problems we've experienced with EPUB over the years, but it was the classic example of you build it, they didn't come, and there was no version of epubcheck that could work with EPUB 3.1, and so basically nobody ever used it. And so it's like, okay, if we're going to make any changes to EPUB in the future, we need to work hand in hand with epubcheck so that when the spec comes out, the tool to check it is ready and able to work on it. And so we have tremendous support from the DAISY consortium and, Matt again, and above all, Romain Deltour, who's the primary maintainer of epubcheck. And so they've been working really closely with us through the entire process. Every time we make a change, they make a note of it and, add a different check to epubcheck.
There are also updates to EPUB Accessibility. So EPUB Accessibility 1.1 will be released along with EPUB 3.3. Some new additions, it's mainly editorial, but there are some new things around EPUB creators being allowed to conform to the latest version of WCAG. And so the restriction has been reduced there. So it's whatever the latest version of WCAG is the one that you can conform to. This was important considering, well, 2.1 had come out in the intervening years. There are more versions of WCAG on the way, including 2.2 and 2.3. There are new recommendations for page lists and page numbering, just to provide some more information on those areas. Updates to ensure conformance with the European Accessibility Act, which I know is a concern for many. And so the document is updated to reflect that. And there's some new refines. The refines attribute has been added to some accessibility metadata fields to allow for more information to be provided by content creators. And as what happens with every upgrade to a new version of anything, EPUB 3.3, we have identified some types of unused features. We have 3 types. So we have what we call underimplemented features. These features are ones where there may be one or more implementations, but they're not commonly used and should be considered risky for content creators. We also have deprecated features. These features are ones that the working group no longer recommends to be used as they have limited to no support in the market. An example of this would be something like EPUB switch. And we also have legacy features, features that we have retained for backwards compatibility purposes with previous versions of EPUB, but may not be supported by reading systems. And a good example of this is the NCX file.
The NCX, the file that will never die. We've tried and tried and tried, but the fact that it's legacy, what that means from a spec point of view is that, an EPUB 3 must use the nav file for navigation. And even if the NCX is present, it's not allowed to use it for navigation. It has to ignore these things. It's only there for an EPUB 2 reading system to be able to handle it. And yes, I think we have tests for that.
Mm-hmm. And just to give a little bit more information about underimplemented features, because this is kind of new for EPUB 3.3, to give 2 examples of features that we believe are potentially at risk or underimplemented, one of which is rendition flow. This was a feature that was designed to allow content creators the ability to tell a reading system to display the content vertically in a scrolled fashion. It included the ability to do either paginated scrolling or freeform, similar to how web pages are rendered. And while the scrolling feature is actually implemented in many reading systems, it's more based on user discretion than creators. And so we believe this feature is at risk. And as you saw in the testing earlier, the other one that we know of for now is manifest fallbacks, intended to allow content creators to provide an alternate version of a file if the main one did not render. In practice, it appears that this is underutilized, but also undersupported. To give you an idea of how we determine this, we won't officially declare any feature under implemented until the testing is complete, because we want to see, based on the implementation status of the different features, is this actually under implemented? We might be surprised to see how something is implemented, or that we see things that are not in this list that also fall into the under implemented category.
Yes, and we have this category because of testing. This is the stuff we've learned by trying things out and seeing what's actually happening out there.
Should probably add that this is a bit unique for EPUB. Most of the times for the W3C recommendation process, specs that go through the process are new or a new feature. And so if they were under implemented, they likely wouldn't make it to the final recommendation. However, EPUB has been around a lot longer than this version. And so we have to be cognizant of backwards compatibility and the fact that there might be an implementation of something out there for a very specific purpose, and it should stay in the spec, but we should steer people away from using it at large. A note about EPUB type. EPUB type has officially been recommended against as an accessibility enhancement in version 3.3. This is in favor of better support for the ARIA properties in browsers, as well as increased adoption of dpub ARIA for documents. In EPUB 3.3, we recommend replacing EPUB type with an appropriate ARIA role and the appropriate value when it's being used for accessibility purposes. So keep that in mind if you're using EPUB type.
Yeah, this was one of those. I think this has been misunderstood throughout its history in EPUB. It's like, oh, this is something that looks like it would be really useful for accessibility, but it turned out that, no reading system was using it for that purpose. And in fact, no reading system was using any EPUB type value for anything except for the few exceptions of making pop-up footnotes work and identifying the primary navigation document. And so given that EPUB is really built from web technologies, our continuing evolution is towards, greater harmony with the web and doing things the way the web does. And, the web does accessibility really well, partly because of ARIA. So we're definitely moving in that direction.
And we do have some new features. We have two new media types. EPUB 3.3 adds WebP, which is a modern image format for the web. This allows for smaller file sizes with the same quality as JPEG or PNG. We are also adding Opus, which is an open source audio codec, which is also designed for the web, with streaming, storage, and a wide range of support for different bit rates and sampling rates built directly into the format. So content people should be happy.
Yeah, this is, again, most reading systems are based on, web browser rendering engines. And so as they add features, for example, support for new image types, then EPUB is sort of saying, oh, there's enough adoption. Now we can use this because, again, we're sort of evolving along with the web a little bit.
All right, and the best news of all, you are already creating EPUB 3.3 files.
I think this is the core mission of the working group has been not to break any existing content. Backwards compatibility has been our highest priority from the start. As Wendy mentioned, EPUB has been around for a long, long time. There are literally millions of EPUB files out there. And, just as in some web working groups, they say their goal is not to break the web. We don't want to break any existing EPUBs. And so even when there's features that are problematic or not widely used, we have to be very, very, very careful about that. Basically, what we're doing is expanding, what's allowed in EPUB and not contracting it. So it's like, here's some new media types. So you can use these now, but all the old media types still work. So all your existing files are still valid. It's like, I work for Hachette, we have, how many EPUBs do we have? 80,000 or something. And they all, they were all probably created mostly as 3.0.1, but when 3.2 came out and epubcheck came out, every single one of them was okay. It automatically became an EPUB 3.2 file. We didn't have to change what we were doing. We just had a few more options to improve our EPUBs.
Yeah, and this is how we feel about going to Canada recommendation. I couldn't resist.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Wendy and Dave. We do have some questions. I'm going to start, I think, with maybe the question on every publisher's mind that they were too afraid to ask in the chat, even though this is a very safe space and you're welcome to ask those questions. Do I need to change anything about how I'm building my EPUBs?
No. You might want to use WebP if you're worried about your image sizes, but keep using epubcheck, keep doing what you're doing. I mean, for some of the features that we've mentioned, like fallbacks and things, you might want to be mindful of how you're using those. But if you're testing your books too, and you're already using fallbacks, you might have noticed that things don't work quite the way you're expecting them to.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't quite say don't change what you're doing if your books aren't as accessible as they could be. I think that's always going to be the focus, that especially as accessibility techniques evolve and as we have a lot better tools for checking accessibility like ACE, and then like the certification providers and things like that. I would urge every publisher to do that. I would also urge every publisher to at least move to EPUB 3, because the baseline of accessibility is so much higher. And, what EPUB 3 has been around for, is it 11 years at this point? I think it's kind of time.
Yeah, if you were waiting for stability for EPUB 3 to switch,
it's here.
Please do it now.
Yeah, but there's no foundational change. The package file hasn't changed. The structure of an EPUB hasn't changed. It's still XHTML5. It's still CSS. All the foundations of EPUB remain unchanged. There's a reason we're calling it 3.3 and not 4. We're not making breaking changes. This is just sort of a small evolution to make things clearer and to keep up with the underlying web technologies. We're not really trying to make anything major. And as I said, backward compatibility has been our #1 priority through this entire process.
Amazing. I think it's unfortunate we can't see everyone on the webinar today, because I think the celebrating we would have witnessed when you said they didn't necessarily have to change anything would be pretty exciting. To kind of follow up on, this conversation about whether or not people need to change things or how they might need to address this in their workflow, will epubcheck still be backward compatible with earlier versions of EPUB?
Yeah, so same deal, basically. If you are checking an EPUB 2 file, it will check against the EPUB 2 rules. If you are checking an EPUB 3 file, it will check against EPUB 3.3 rules. That's basically, it's always what epubcheck has done. That won't change.
Yeah, and even in the package file itself, it says package version equals 3.0, and that has been true for all the different point releases of EPUB 3. I mean, I think that's the way I think about it. This is EPUB 3. It's been EPUB 3 for 11 years, and the changes have been very minor. And so nothing to worry about. And so we have deliberately not, put a version equals 3.01 or 3.2 or whatever. It's EPUB 3. It's just ever so slightly improved, and the improvements are sort of largely editorial rather than substantive.
Excellent, excellent. Continuing our topic of handling your older files, will there at some point be supportive documents on how to update legacy EPUB content to new specifications? The question asker says it's a bit of a headache moving from, say, 2 to 3.2 or 3.3. Is the recommendation to scrap your old file and just create something new? Or is there some good resources available to help make that switch?
As far as transforming versus starting over, I think that depends a lot on context. If you could make a really good EPUB 2, and then automated tools could do sort of 99% of the work of turning that into EPUB 3 if you had sort of a good starting place. Because you can write a script that turns an NCX into a nav file, for example, and you can script, updating HTML 1.1 to HTML5. But it's probable that there's enough issues with the semantic structure of the EPUB 2 that you're going to get a lot of benefit by, sort of maybe starting from a little earlier place so that you can take advantage of the better semantic markup that HTML5 allows. I think there've been I think I recall some blog posts and stuff about 2 to 3 conversions, but I don't remember anything specific off the top of my head.
Excellent. We mentioned that epubcheck is updated or will be updated. Will the ACE accessibility checker also be updated, or will accessibility assessment be built into epubcheck in some way?
That is a good question. It's not going to be, as far as I know, it is not going to be built into epubcheck. It is still going to remain its own tool, but hope maybe Matt or Roman are around to ACE. Okay, Charles says that ACE will be updated, and I believe Charles. So
wonderful.
Yeah. ACE will be updated.
Yeah, there's been a deliberate, in the past, there's been a deliberate choice to not tie the accessibility spec to particular versions of EPUB because, partly the accessibility principles are pretty universal, and also the things that the accessibility principles address, aren't changing. HTML5 isn't changing because of this version of EPUB. So everything about document structure applies equally, and again, the nature of the package document doesn't change. I think one of the substantive changes here is that we'll be able to refine accessibility metadata in the package file. And so that can allow us more nuance in describing the accessibility features of a publication. But, I don't think ACE will have to change much, if at all, because of this.
Excellent, wonderful. Do any of the new accessibility recommendations in 3.3, do they go beyond current Benetech accessibility standards? Do you know?
I think Charles might actually have answered that I was looking at the Q&A as well. If you have questions about Benetech, I would ask Charles up here.
Amazing, amazing.
Father Charles.
Charles is here in the chat today.
Charles is in the chat. Ping Charles, because I would not want to answer a question about Benetech.
That seems absolutely, absolutely fair. There's been some really amazing questions. So let me just jump back through with the list here and see. Will reading systems support 3.3?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's kind of the same thing with you are currently producing EPUB 3.3 files.
Right.
Reading systems currently support EPUB 3.3. They're obviously, I mean, we'll be doing testing, as you can see, to see some more features to see how specifically that support goes. And of course, for things like WebP and Opus, it might depend on platform as things get implemented. But yeah, reading systems will support your book still, don't worry.
I just this moment looked at the WebP test in Thorium and it passes. So Thorium, a version that I probably downloaded before there was much of a 3.3, because of being based on web technology, it is supporting 3.3 already, probably without even knowing it.
Wonderful. Related to this question about support for some of these new formats, a question from the chat. Image support has been spotty in the past. Should we be less tentative about using images in EPUB now?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to
right.
see in the tests, because we have tests for every single image type
Excellent.
that EPUB supports officially.
And I think it's also, I think, some depends on what markets you're selling your book into and what the reading systems are like in that particular markup. But I think we've also come a long way in figuring out like good CSS so that images size appropriately for, the wide range of contexts that an EPUB is used in, from, tiny phone screens to, big fancy tablets and all that kind of stuff. I think most of us have realized that we can do a lot better job now than we could, say, in 2007 when EPUB first came out.
Absolutely. So question asker, you can feel free to go absolutely wild with images with good alt text for accessibility in your EPUBs.
Don't forget your alt text.
To continue maybe a speed round on some of these compatibility type questions. Will the EPUB 3.3 spec address handling typekit fonts?
Typekit fonts.
I don't know.
I think question asker needs to be more, what file type is that? I'm not a font person. We support WAF, WAF2, TTF, OTF. Google fonts.
Adobe thing.
All right, we will see if we get more
Adobe Typekit. If it's
Adobe Typekit.
If it is a font file, then yes.
And we do, we do allow like remote font, fonts don't have to be part of the package in EPUB, so you can use sort of web fonts in general. I'm not entirely clear on how much support there is for that. The advantage of font things in general is that CSS has really clear mechanisms for what happens if something breaks. And so, I mean, there's situations, of course, where you do need the exact font to support, languages and special characters and stuff. So
yeah,
again, I want to look at our tests.
Look at our tests. I would say in general, while you can remotely reference a font type, it's always better to put the font in if you need it, especially if you're publishing in a language that is outside of the like standard Latin alphabet. Always be safe with your fonts.
Wonderful, wonderful. This is going back to some of the discussion around EPUB type and ARIA, and bringing that more in line with the way we handle roles on the web. How do you accessibly support defining book-specific regions like chapter, prologue, preface, etc., that don't exist in the web?
So some of this is covered by EPUB ARIA.
Yeah.
So look at the EPUB ARIA list. That list is being further refined and there's work happening now with the ARIA working group in order to better support the doc properties, because there are many of them and they are not fully supported in the web yet. I don't want to sound too basic by saying this, but also name your chapters, provide a title for your documents, ensure you are filling in that title element at the top of a page, doing it in your table of contents, etc. That is still always going to be the most reliable way a user is going to know, is this chapter 1, is this chapter 2, is this the prologue? But also the DPUB ARIA roles are coming into their own a lot more now. So use those.
Excellent. Excellent. A reading systems question. When do you recommend reading systems migrate to epubcheck 3.3?
I would say, as someone who is currently going through this process right now, as soon as you can. The beta is pretty stable. It's not meant, as far as I know, it's not going to change anytime soon. I would recommend starting testing now, just making sure that you're not seeing massive changes in error counts and things like that. Test now, and then when it's official, press the button on that release.
Excellent, excellent. Any idea if Adobe InDesign will be updated to export 3.3 with WebP images?
Does InDesign export EPUB now in any meaningful way?
Shots fired.
Shots fired. We wish, we hope. I know some people have been talking to Adobe. Adobe does export EPUB 3. InDesign exports EPUB 3. As for if it updates its image formats, bug Adobe. Send in lots of emails to the customer feedback line.
Excellent. Is EPUB 3.3 compliant with EAA requirements?
Yes. European Accessibility Act. Yes, EPUB 3.3 is, in particular, reflowable EPUB documents in particular. Fixed layout is kind of questionable because most fixed layout documents do not allow for things like text resizing, which is listed in EAA as a requirement. Sorry, I'm talking really fast. So yes, follow the EPUB accessibility guidelines, alt text, structure, navigability, all of that. The other thing to consider for European Accessibility Act is ensuring that, and this isn't an EPUB feature, but in your metadata and your conversations with your retailers, allow for text to speech, things like that, because that is part of EAA as well.
Excellent. Okay, let me see here. So many good questions still. When EPUB 3.3 becomes a W3C recommendation, do you envision it being submitted as the next ISO EPUB standard?
Oh, that's an interesting question. And I can't begin to understand ISO politics and procedures well enough to answer it. I think there's some advantages because I think having it as a W3 recommendation will allow a much simplified process for it to become an ISO standard. There are people in the working group who are very interested in this topic, so talk to Makoto.
Yeah, I'd say it's probably likely, but neither of us know or are part of that process. So probably, but yeah, talk to Makoto.
Excellent. Okay. So we've talked a little bit about what publishers can do to make sure they're publishing books in accordance with new specs and workflows. What tools are available for independent writers to author books using EPUB 3.3?
Adobe InDesign, though, of course, for the average person who doesn't have a creative whatever license, maybe not so approachable. I believe some of the tools out there that I know export EPUB 3 include Vellum. Oh my gosh, I'm blanking on all the tool names.
Like
Calibre or Calibre technically does. Sigil.
There's the word to EPUB.
Oh yeah, actually, word to EPUB.
The most user-friendly of the possibilities these days.
I would say for lay people who aren't super familiar with formatting, hands down, Word to EPUB is the best tool. It will also get you significantly towards a very accessible EPUB 3 just through conversion. A little bit of work needed afterwards, but in terms of conversion tool, it's the best one I've used.
All right, Word to EPUB for all of you independent authors out there. Check it out.
Can I spend 10 seconds answering one question that you didn't mention that I saw in the Google Doc?
Absolutely, you can, Dave.
Yes, we should have an index and we'll look into that. I know that some other spec generating tools have better indexing features than probably what we're doing, but yeah, we'll look into that. Indexes rock.
All right,
Indexes are great.
Indexes on the table. I think, let me just see. There were so many good questions, so many things to think about here. This last question, any insights from the gatekeeper's perspective, Apple, Amazon, other retailers?
They tend not to share their perspectives with us. And my mind reading skills are obviously subpar, given how my life is operated so far. So I guess there's not much I can think to say.
Yeah, don't have a lot there for you. I can say that Amazon at some point did review the spec recently, so they are aware of it. And I mean, Kindle does accept EPUB now, so that's a step in the right direction. And Apple was part of the process as well, so they're aware, probably.
Excellent, excellent. So I think we are coming up at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Dave and Wendy, for joining me today and sharing your immense expertise on this topic. We are so grateful to benefit from your knowledge here today. Before we go, we'd love if you, all of you wonderful attendees, could provide feedback on this session. We'll be dropping a link to a survey in the chat. Please take a couple of minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it is available. And before I let you all go, I would like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the Canada Book Fund. And thank you to all of you for attending and learning from us this afternoon. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Publish accessible EPUBs.
So much.